What the Thucydides Trap really means for the Iran war. Is the Iran war becoming something bigger than a regional conflict? The Thucydides Trap is the idea that when a rising power threatens to displace an established one, fear, miscalculation, and hardening rivalry can make war more likely. The phrase comes from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides and was popularized recently, mainly as a way to think about U.S. China competition, not Iran. That matters because the Iran war now unfolding is real, immediate, and dangerous, but it is not a textbook Thucydides trap in the cleanest sense. The war that began with U.S. Israeli attacks on Iran has escalated into a wider regional crisis involving Israeli strikes on Iranian energy targets, retaliation across the Gulf, disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, ceasefire diplomacy, and warnings about both nuclear site risk and global economic fallout. The more useful question is not whether the current situation is literally a Thucydides trap. It is whether a regional war is now colliding with great power competition in a way that could make the international system more brittle, more polarized, and more prone to larger confrontation. China and Russia are already positioning themselves diplomatically around the conflict, while the economic shock from Hormuz is radiating far beyond the battlefield. The story turns on whether the Iran war remains a brutal regional conflict or becomes a wider test of power, credibility, and alignment in a more dangerous global order. Key points. The Thucydides trap describes the danger that fear between a rising power and an established power can turn rivalry into war. It is most often used for major power competition, especially the United States and China. The current Iran war does not fit that model neatly because Iran is not a rising peer challenger on the scale of a Sparta-Athens or U.S. China-style power transition. But the war can still interact with trap-like dynamics by raising questions of deterrence, prestige, alliance behavior, and control of a vital global choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. The war has already moved beyond a narrow Israel-Iran exchange, with attacks on energy infrastructure, strikes tied to U.S. forces, and active ceasefire diplomacy involving regional mediators. What matters next is whether the conflict de-escalates through a ceasefire or hardens into a longer contest over maritime control, energy flows, and regional order. The non-obvious risk is that even if this is not a classic power-to-transition war, it can still strengthen the wider conditions that make major power confrontation more likely later. What the Thucydides trap actually means. Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. In the modern version of the argument, the trap is not simply that one country grows stronger. It is that the established power becomes fearful, the rising power becomes more assertive. Both sides interpret each other's moves in the worst possible light, and crisis management gets harder with each round of escalation. That is why the phrase has had such staying power. It offers a simple, memorable explanation for how systems slide from competition into war. Graham Allison helped make it famous by using it as a frame for the United States and China, arguing that clashes between rising and ruling powers have often ended badly, though not always. But the idea is also controversial. Critics argue that the concept is too neat, that history does not sort cleanly into reusable templates, and that leadership, geography, nuclear deterrence, domestic politics, and alliance structures matter too much to reduce war to one recurring law. Some scholars also argue that Thucydides himself was more subtle than the slogan built from his work. That criticism matters here. If the concept is used carelessly, it becomes a machine for forcing very different conflicts into the same story. What is unfolding in the Iran war right now? As of April 6, 2026, the war is in a volatile phase shaped by three overlapping pressures: military escalation, energy disruption, and diplomatic scrambling. Reuters reports the conflict began on February 28, when the United States and Israel launched attacks on Iran. Since then, the war has expanded geographically and economically. In the last phase of fighting, Israel has struck Iranian energy infrastructure, including a major petrochemical facility in the South Pars gas field. Iranian officials and state-linked spokesmen say Iran has also targeted U.S. forces and regional infrastructure, including in Kuwait. Reuters and AP both describe an increasingly regionalized conflict, rather than a contained bilateral exchange. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of the crisis. Iran's restriction of traffic through the strait has disrupted energy flows, driven price volatility, and turned a military confrontation into a global economic problem. Reuters reports that the closure has sharply divided winners and losers across Middle Eastern oil producers and has fed wider worries about inflation, supply chains, and growth from Asia to Europe. At the same time, diplomacy has not disappeared. Regional mediators, including Pakistan, have circulated ceasefire proposals that would pair an immediate halt in hostilities with movement toward reopening Hormuz and broader talks. Reuters reports that both Washington and Tehran have been studying variants of such a framework. Though distrust remains high and nothing appears settled, that creates a strange and dangerous picture. The war is escalating and negotiating at the same time. That is usually a sign that both sides still think force can improve their bargaining position. Why this is not a clean Thucydides trap? The cleanest version of the Thucydides trap involves a rising power challenging the dominant position of a ruling power at the level of system leadership. That is why the concept is most often attached to U.S. China rivalry. Iran is not in that category. It is a powerful regional actor, but not a rising hegemon on the scale implied by the original model. So if someone says the Iran war proves the Thucydides trap, that is too crude. This war is better understood first as a regional conflict with global consequences. It involves deterrence failure, long-running hostility, proxy and direct confrontation, nuclear-related risk, maritime coercion, and competing political aims between Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran. Those are not trivial details. They are the structure of the conflict. There is another reason the analogy is limited. In the classic trap, the fear runs primarily between the established great power and the rising rival. Here, the drivers are more layered. Israel is pursuing its own war logic. The United States is balancing military pressure with coercive diplomacy. Iran is using regional reach and Hormuz leverage to raise the cost of escalation. None of that maps neatly onto Athens versus Sparta. So the honest answer is this: no, the Iran war is not itself the Thucydides trap, not in the literal sense. Where the two stories start to connect, the stronger argument is more indirect. A regional war can become strategically entangled with great power rivalry, even when it did not begin as a great power succession crisis. That is where the Iran war starts to matter in Thucydidean terms. First, the war is becoming a test of credibility. U.S. threats tied to Hormuz, Israeli attacks on strategic Iranian infrastructure, and Iranian strikes across the Gulf all raise the stakes of backing down. Once leaders frame a conflict in terms of resolve and punishment, compromise becomes harder because concession starts to look like weakness. Second, the war is stressing the global system through a choke point that matters far beyond the Middle East. Hormuz is not just a local waterway, it is a leverage point. The more central it becomes to the conflict, the more outside powers are pulled in by energy exposure, shipping risk, inflation, and strategic signaling. Reuters and AP reporting makes clear that the economic spillovers are already global. Third, outside powers are starting to align around the crisis in ways that reflect broader competition. China has said it is ready to work with Russia at the United Nations to ease tensions. Russia has described the region as being on fire and emphasized the global economic consequences. These are diplomatic positions, not military entry points, but they show how a regional war can harden international blocs. That is the deeper link. The Iran war may not be a Thucydides trap, but it can still become a feeder conflict for an increasingly trap-like world. What most coverage misses, most coverage treats the analogy as a yes or no question. Either the Iran war is a Thucydides trap or it is not. That misses the more important mechanism. The real issue is not whether Iran is the new Athens. It is whether the war is intensifying a broader climate in which major powers interpret regional crises through the lens of prestige, deterrence, access, and alignment. Once that happens, even a non-systemic war can become systemically dangerous. There is also a second hinge that gets less attention than it should. Hormuz changes the conflict from a military contest into a pressure campaign on the global economy. That means time itself becomes a weapon. Every extra day of disruption raises outside incentives to intervene diplomatically, coercively, or militarily. In that sense, the Strait is not just part of the battlefield. It is the device that converts a regional war into an international stress test. The real danger is not analogy, but escalation logic. Historical analogies are useful when they clarify. They become dangerous when they flatten. Calling every serious geopolitical crisis a Thucydides trap can make leaders and audiences think war is more inevitable than it really is. That matters because one of the strongest criticisms of the concept is that it can smuggle fatalism into strategy. If policymakers start believing that structural rivalry makes conflict unavoidable, they may take more risks, discount diplomacy, and misread off-ramps as illusions. The Iran war shows why that matters. Even now, while threats are escalating, mediators are still trying to build a ceasefire architecture. That does not mean peace is close. It means choice still exists. The point is not that structure is irrelevant. It is that structure is not destiny. This is one of the most important lessons from Thucydides himself and from the debates around him. Fear matters. Power shifts matter. But prudence, signaling, and decision-making matter too. Wars are shaped by structure, then accelerated or restrained by human choice. That is why the Iran war should be read carefully, not as proof that ancient history has mechanically repeated itself, but as a live example of how quickly coercion, prestige, and mistrust can outgrow the original battlefield. What to watch now? The next phase will likely turn on four things. The first is whether the ceasefire framework gains real political backing or remains a diplomatic placeholder. Reuters reporting suggests serious mediation is happening, but also that mistrust between the parties is deep and that major terms remain contested. The second is the Strait of Hormuz. If traffic remains heavily constrained, the pressure on outside states will keep rising. That means more economic fallout, more political pressure, and a narrower margin for controlled escalation. The third is whether strikes expand further into infrastructure and nuclear-adjacent sites. The IAEA has already confirmed impacts near Bushehr, even if the plant itself was not damaged. That is the kind of threshold that can change the diplomatic and strategic environment very quickly. The fourth is great power positioning. If China and Russia remain primarily diplomatic actors, the conflict may stay regionally centered even while causing global pain. If the war begins to reshape broader alliance behavior and strategic commitments, the Thucydides language will feel less misplaced. So do Thucydides Trap and the Iran war relate? Yes, but not in the lazy way. The current war is not a textbook power to transition struggle between a rising hegemon and an established one, but it is unfolding inside a world already defined by rivalry, mistrust, and stress deterrence. That means the analogy is not best used as a label for the war itself. It is best used as a warning about the kind of international system this war could help create. And that is the broader significance. A regional war does not need to be the trap to tighten it.